Welcome to episode 7 in season 2 of the JAIAC's Dispute Management in a New World podcast series. In this episode, we take a look at value chain economics in the construction industry. We're, of course, joined by our resident guest, the JAIAC Secretary General and Dispute Management Practitioner, Dr. Christopher Malcolm. I'm your host, Roxene Nickle, and on this episode, our conversation with Dr. Malcolm is a first of a two-part discussion. Welcome back, Dr. Malcolm.
Thank you, Roxene.
So let's get right into it. Now, the construction industry is a key sector for economic development. So what makes this sector a consideration for dispute management?
Well, the sector is key, but it is also a complex sector. It is complex for several reasons, including that it very often has multiple components to it and multiple parties involved in it. It also very often, as part of its complexity as well, has related complex disputes or controversies arising out of it. It very often as well includes multi-parties. Very often, sometimes too, involving parties from multiple jurisdictions, relying on voluminous data and documents involved in it, and very often high value and high stakes, and also in circumstances where there's often a reliance on boilerplate templates and sometimes bespoke arrangements. But they are, at the short of it all, you typically have sometimes very complex contractual relationships. And those complex contractual relationships, which are the regulating tools, as I would have mentioned in another podcast, for any transaction, are complex relationships which by their very nature require particular arrangements to be put in place to deal with inevitable disputes that happen.
So there are many industry segments that are included under the umbrella of construction. Can you tell us some of those, like land and sea?
Well, yes. Construction typically involves anything where there's a build element to it. And that can be land-based, it can be sea-based, it can even be space-based. These would have included some level of construction related to them.
Right.
And of course, when you're thinking of construction projects, land-based, for example, you're thinking of houses, you're thinking of bridges, you're thinking of hotels, you're thinking of convention centers, and so on. You're also thinking, of course, of roads and those sorts of things. But when you then get to the sea-based, you're thinking of oil rigs,
right,
possibly which are offshore. You're thinking of piers, you're thinking of dredging arrangements, you're thinking of all these things which have all sorts of components to them. The short is, as we think of construction, sometimes people think in a very narrow way of construction in the sense of a building, in the ordinary sense of something to house people. Very often construction involves much more than that. It could be built for a nuclear plant, it could be built for anything.
Okay, thank you for that. I wasn't quite sure myself either. Within this particular sector, which is complex, what are some of the emerging development and value chain economic trends?
Well, in this age, probably it's a good one to start, is that there's this now greater interest in ensuring that we have buildings put up where there's carbon neutrality, with climate change effects in mind, and ensuring as much as is possible that you reduce the carbon footprint of the sector. In fact, the construction sector, as I mentioned that, is one of the highest carbon emitting sectors that you could think of. In fact, 30 other percent of carbon emissions globally are considered to be emissions related to the construction sector. So one of the emerging trends is to see how it is that you can have greener buildings, buildings that use less air conditioning, for example, buildings that use more renewable materials, buildings that are much more reliant on construction processes that have less to do with fossil fuels and so on. All of those are things which are emerging. And of course, a significant factor always is how you can get more for less. So wherever you go, people are always thinking of how you can get stronger materials, but at less cost. How you can implement buildings which are able to deal with the emerging climate adaptation requirements. How you can put buildings in place that are much more able to deal with adverse and difficult climatic conditions, whether they be in a hurricane zone, in a volcanic zone, in all sorts of zones which may be not the usual type of situation where nothing much happens, but ones where things do happen and ones in which things are becoming more difficult. You know, for example, for us in the Caribbean, we grew up, and most all of us have grown up knowing that we have a hurricane season. And the hurricane season, we learned about June too soon, and by November it was all over. But that has changed. We have now seen hurricanes going into January, into December, and all sorts of months which we're unaccustomed to. And we have seen them becoming more intense. We've seen a lot more rainfall happening in periods when there's rain, but we've also seen much longer drought periods as well. And the question is, of course, you have shorelines which are being eroded. You have depletion of forest reserves and other things related to that. How do you build with those in mind? How do you ensure that as you build, you do not deplete the natural environment more than you have to?
Right.
How do you find renewable use of materials such as bamboo, which is out there with its strong tensile and other strengths, which grows as a grass? How do you use that in your building? How do you use other things that can help you to replenish rather than deplete the environment? Those are some of the trends which are ongoing. And of course, there are all sorts of other ongoing events in relation to how you integrate the diverse professionals who work in the sector, your engineers, your architects, your contractors of all sorts. How do you integrate them in a way where you get the cost efficiencies you require? How do you work as well to create an environment where there are less downtimes on projects, with the resultant greater cost efficiencies as well? So there are multiple things that are happening, and wherever you go, quite frankly, be it in a big society or in a small society, these are factors and matters that are of concern to all of us.
So it is reported that there's an estimated global value of 11.4 trillion US dollars in 2020. Can you say who are some of the players that come to mind when we talk about the construction sector?
Well, the construction sector and the good value, one of the areas that you always think of is energy. Energy and infrastructure are the big ones that you would be thinking of. And when I say energy, I'm talking about oil prospecting, oil rigs, and natural gas, and all those sorts of things which flow there in terms of big entities in the construction sector. You also clearly have to think of bridges, and we've seen across the world these mega bridge and mega dam projects and all of these other sorts of things happening. And those, of course, are biggies in the construction sector. And of course, when they happen, as we're seeing more of these days, is that there was a time when you could think of a project which was in many ways pretty localized in terms of where inputs came from. What is happening now in the construction sector, the global sector, is that you have more and more products and services relating to the sector coming from across borders. So China, for example, in the last many years has become a place from which you have a lot more products relating to building happening. The steel industry has shifted in many ways away from traditional markets that we in the West were used to being shifted to China, where China now produces and has been producing a lot of steels and fittings and all sorts of things related to the construction industry. And once you start doing that, what do you then require? You then have supply chain related to shipping lines and mega ships being built, and all of those are what again? Shipyards, big shipping yards. You have construction going on in relation to these big mega ships and everything else. So it's an ecosystem which is constantly expanding to meet the emerging and growing needs of our societies as we seek to transition from one phase to another.
Is effective dispute management a shared goal for all players in the sector, or does the burden fall on one set to ensure that dispute management considerations are within their contracts?
The fact is that in every arrangement, there will always be persons who are more interested in moving particular objectives along than others, and no less dispute management. And part of it is that different people will go to the process of a project with different objectives in mind, with different levels of, in and out of quotes, education about how the process works, and also with different objectives by reference to financing and what that means. So dispute management properly dealt with usually requires some commitment at the outset. As distinct, I would hasten to add, from relying purely on dispute resolution, which is back-end in every sense of the word. So litigation, for example, happens when everything has gone bad. Arbitration also happens typically when everything has gone bad. But if you think about dispute management as a holistic process where you're thinking of avoidance, you're thinking of prevention, you're thinking of seamless project flow, then that requires a lot of inputs at the beginning, including cost inputs. And some persons are typically more prepared to see that as a viable expenditure rather than others. So while it is that it should be a shared goal, and while it is that everybody would have an interest in ensuring that you manage disputes well, because it really is a shared value that you get out of it, there are some persons who are more prepared to invest in it than there are others. So that may be the distinction rather than the need for a shared objective. And also you have a situation also where, depending on the nature of the entity involved, who their shareholders are, what the ethos of the company involved is, and so on, those may be things which are greater drivers for effective dispute management on the one hand for some entities than it might be for others. In a typical construction project, you will have various phases that you go through. Of course, you go through the ideation process, people coming up with an idea of what they want. You then go through the process of trying to flesh that out with professionals, architects and value engineers and all those sorts of persons who will help you to think of the project and how you're able to bring it to market. Once you've gone to that stage, of course, you get your project drawings, you get all the other things that may be associated with that. And ultimately, you move from that process of planning into a process of implementation and ultimately delivery. So there are 3 critical stages of the project that you go through. Now, at the planning stage of the project, when you're moving now from idea to planning with a view to implementation, at that stage when you're now in the process as well of trying to document the arrangement to be delivered, you're putting your contracts and so on in place. At that stage, typically people are hunky-dory and everybody's happy with each other, right? Typically at that point. But at that point, you now have even then parties who each have their own objectives. So if I'm a contractor, I'm interested to know that I'm going to make a profit out of the inputs that I put in the project. And if I'm a developer, similarly, I want to get my development at the cheapest cost possible with the greatest value possible as well. So at that stage, we now need to ensure that we understand what our particular objectives are, understand what the cost and other implications are, understand what the responsibilities are that will flow from the project, try to find an effective way to allocate those responsibilities, and then to effectively document for it. Now, at that stage of documenting, what we're doing then, is putting in place a roadmap for the project, which will hopefully be done in such a way that it will allow for effective dispute avoidance if the roadmap is followed. But let's say we have that roadmap in place that says that in the event the parties cannot agree, or even without getting to that point first, that you have a roadmap that says that in the implementation stage, you will have an adjudicator, let's say, appointed, or a dispute board, or whatever the case may be, appointed. And their role and function is to have ongoing inspection and to do some things along the way in relation to the project. And they may be carrying out that function in a way to say, if there's a problem that they identify, before it morphs into something worse, they will bring it to the attention of the parties and try to find a way to have it resolved effectively at that stage without it getting worse. But sometimes the problems that they identified are not immediately dealt with. And even if dealt with, are not effectively dealt with. And then what may have started out as something which was clearly possible to have been cauterized early, may then, as a result of late cheese or time lag on the part of one party or another, then morph into something else, which leads to a bad beam being put up, which now has to be demolished, or some such thing. So what you now have is something which could have been cured early, morphing into something which results in a breach of contract because you're supposed to put up a straight beam and you put up a lean one, right? And now you have a dispute arising for breach of contract, which could then now, if not properly dealt with, result in ultimate adjudication or some other process being used to try to resolve a dispute that has arisen because the person who has received the lean beam doesn't want to pay for it. The person who has built it wants to ensure that they get paid for it, or even if they don't get paid fully, that they get paid something for having done some work, right? So you now have a dispute to be resolved. So what we started out with was a system that was put in place that, if properly followed and properly acted upon, could have resulted in avoidance of that happening. But it not having resulted the way you wanted it to, you ended up then with a dispute that now has to be resolved. And that is how these things can morph from one thing into another, requiring action at one level or another, which you may not have initially hoped for, but which nevertheless can manifest quite easily in the course of a project.
Is there a body within the construction sector that assists with the dispute management awareness?
There are several entities both at local and international levels that have an interest in construction projects and how they work. And you have, for example, surveyors who are formed into groups, and their interest is, in addition to serving themselves together, they're interested in putting out industry standards and so on that persons may be interested in. You have groups related to architects and contractors and all sorts of persons who are there. And they have an interest because, for several reasons, one of which is that they have an interest in protecting their members and the rights of their members. But they also have an interest in protecting the integrity of their professions. So it is not in their interest for shoddy construction work, for example, to go up or any such thing, because the moment it happens, it reflects badly on them as a group. If you have bad workmanship from, let's say, a geotechnical engineer, that reflects on other people thinking twice about the geotech they employed and so on, and the work and worth of geotech engineers. And that could extend to any aspect of the construction process. So what you have are persons there. But in addition to that, you also have institutes which are set up, and institutions that are set up to deal with dispute resolution and so on in the construction sector. And they too are involved in setting out their own guidelines and practices, and are also involved in the process of training to assist persons to do whatever. So for example, in the area of construction, the ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, has standards that apply, for example, to construction, and they have a number of arbitration and related matters that they do in that area. And they are interested in seeing people well trained in how to manage arbitrations in the sector. Then you have other institutions that are in the business of providing standard form documents. In the context of Jamaica, we have a local body, for example, that does that. In the context of other jurisdictions across the world, we do. Internationally, we have institutions such as FIDIC, which is a Federation of Construction Engineers, who have standard form building and related contracts that they make available for persons to use. And these are used as standard form documents, and they are designed, frankly, trying to balance the respective interests of developers, contractors, and so on, in a view that if parties sign on to them and use them effectively, then construction projects are likely to run better. If persons do not use them well, or even if having signed on to them and use them as the basis for their construction contracts, then if they're not adhered to properly, then you will nevertheless end up in problems and so on. But the fact is that there are industry associations, and part of what anybody would say is that you need to, if you're in the business, you need to find out what is available, what effective guidance is, and make sure that you train yourselves effectively to be able to offer your services properly in the sector.
Okay, so in what we've been talking about today, what is the role of the JAIAC?
The JAIAC really is there to administer disputes where dispute resolution process is. So and in this context, the JAIAC could be considered back. It does have a front-end element to it, of course, in the business of collaborating and being involved in training and so on. But let us take the back-end dispute resolution aspect of it. What it is that in the sector, remember we said that the sector is likely, and in fact it does result very often in disputes. So let's say when a dispute arises between party A, a developer, and party B, a contractor, over unpaid fees, right? Those parties have the option, if they so desire, and if they agree to that, to have the JAIAC administer an arbitration, adjudication, or other method that they may rely upon to try to resolve that dispute. So the JAIAC, in that sense, would operate as an independent institution offering dispute resolution and related services to the parties, always, of course, on the basis that the parties agree to use the services of the JAIAC.
But let me remind you that you are tuned in to the JAIAC's Dispute Management in a New World podcast, conversations with Dr. Christopher Malcolm, Secretary General of the JAIAC, the first of a two-part discussion on value chain economics in the construction industry. Dr. Malcolm, let's move a little to understanding value chain economics. How do you define that?
Well, any project that you enter into, the hope is to make a profit out of it, to make some money. Nobody wants to go into, unless you're in the business of charity, and even charity has its value in earning money. Right? You're going into a project with the hope of getting money. And there are many parties who usually are connected to a construction project, each wanting to earn something out of it. So let us take a typical construction project anywhere you'll find in the Caribbean, right? And let us say there is an apartment complex being built, right? So just use that as a simple example. On that project, you will have an ideator who becomes a developer, right? Who says, I want to build an apartment complex at 25 Sun in the Sky Drive, right? You do the math. In relation to that, you get your relevant professionals, the construction economists and other people coming in to do all the math and all the calculations to tell you what your input costs are likely to be, including the costs of services to be provided, right? What your likely profit margin is likely to be. And of course, you're working in that project with the hope of making a profit. So that's one person there. The contractor is engaged as a main contractor. And that main contractor comes on and decides, yes, I can build it. And my cost to build it is $20. And in that $20 that he gives you, and $20 could be representative of 20 million or 20 anything, right? In that cost that he gives you, or it gives you if it's a company or whatever, right? Is an indication that I want to have a markup of $5 in profit. So the actual cost of doing the work is $15, but there's a $5 markup for profit that is included in it. So that's the main contractor. The main contractor may then realize, and typically is the case, that he or she or it cannot do all the work that is required. So they need an air conditioning contractor, subcontractor. They need somebody who is in the business of providing electricals. They need somebody who is in the business of doing civil engineering works. They need somebody who is able to... The many component parts in terms of the professionals who come on board, each coming to the table with what? With an expectation of being able to make a return in relation to the work that is being provided. Then you go a little further down the road. On that same project, you have a security company that comes on to ensure that security and order is maintained and that and that the raw materials and so on are not stolen from the project site, right? Then you go a little further down even, and I mean there are skips that I'm making, but you go a little further down, you have somebody on the side of the project who's selling curry goat, manish water, jerk chicken, cigarettes, and whatever they're selling to the workmen who are on the site. And of course the workmen are laborers who expect to earn a living wage so they can take care of their families. And the person who is selling cigarettes and whatever else they're selling are also there. They encamp at the site with a view to saying this project is going to last 24 months. And for that 24-month period, this is where my work site is. I will sell lunch, breakfast, and dinner every single day. And I will ensure that I make money from my cigarettes and all the things. So they have now set up their individual economies, each reliant on this project with a view to making an earning on it. So that is where we are so far. Now there's something else that goes there. If you then take it a little further, you now have a situation where the developer is unlikely to have all the money necessary to build the project. And even if the developer has all the wealth in the world, the developer may not want to take cash from the bank to complete that project. So the developer decides, I'm going to borrow some money in relation to that. So he or she goes to Bank X and decide that I'm going to borrow some money from Bank X to finance this project. The contractors similarly, the main contractors, the subcontractors, and everybody else, realize that they too need to be able to get some monies, and they too are borrowing monies on the project. And guess what? Even the person who is selling curry goat on the side and cigarette, they realize them can make a little money over 24 months, so they go and borrow some money from their cousins or their friends or their neighbors. So everybody in the context of that project is borrowing. And when you borrow, what do you have to do? You have to repay what you borrow, very often with interest. So there is an ecosystem that is created where there is money flowing around, a lot of it based on borrowing. And in relation to that, there is an economic system that has effectively been created, linked to that project, which has to be sustained. And if in that project, one or the other of the parties fails to meet his or her or its obligation at any time, it affects everybody else. So the developer has to pay the contractor, who then has to pay the subcontractors, who then has to pay the laborers. And very often, guess what? Even the vendor is not going to be paid every day. They say we'll pay you fortnightly or however often we get paid. So there is now this system operating where everybody is reliant on the other to be able to make the earnings that they're hoping for, and hopefully at the end of it be able to turn a little money which they can put in the bank anyway. So we have this economic system being created, and that is something which everybody is looking to acquire value out of. So the value chain is that chain which involves all the project participants from the very top to the person at the very bottom, each hoping to get out of it an economic value which will put them in a better place than they were prior to the start of the project.
How has the construction value chain issues been impacted in domestic economies since the onset of the pandemic?
Well, that now changes the dynamic significantly, because take the same example. So the owner decides that I'm building this apartment complex, goes to the contractor, and the contractor decides, I am going to source all of my staircases, all of my cement, and all of my steel from China, which then has to travel to Jamaica or Barbados or wherever by ships. Mm-hmm. You've had an impact being created in the supply chain through shipping, and also there was a point in the pandemic where there were labor and other shortages and so on created, sometimes on account of lockdowns and sometimes on account of the virus itself.
Right.
Having created issues. So if you now have a situation where there's a delay, right, in shipment and in the provision of raw materials and related to the project, what do you then have? You have ongoing delays, and if there's a delay and people can't complete on time, what is the common denominator in relation to banks? Banks lend you money and they tell you a time within which you need to pay, and they have interest that is accruing on it. So for that period, for example, while you are unable to work and the project is idle and the bank has interest that continues to accrue, what are you doing? You're now finding yourself in a position where if you're not careful and if the circumstances don't change, you could find the project making you insolvent rather than profitable at the end of the day. What is happening is that the global problems that are being created, which have affected shipping and related supply chain issues, are now causing a great problem. We saw, for example, that towards the end of 2021, we saw all of these issues happening out in the US with all sorts of containers clogged up literally out in California, and people waiting for items to go on their shopping shelves and all sorts of things to happen. What does that mean? The person who was waiting on a Christmas tree to sell it, an artificial one can't sell it. The person who was waiting on a toy to sustain his or her business cannot do it. And the same principle operates in relation to the construction sector as well, because it is all related, you know.
Right.
We go back to no man is an island. No project is itself an island. It is all reliant on a chain which has a beginning somewhere, ends somewhere, and there are multiple players in it. And if the thing is not working seamlessly, and there are not adequate arrangements in it to allow for that to happen, then you are going to have spillover effects, and ultimately everything suffers at one level or another. And in our economies, small economies like ours, where we rely as significantly as we do on things which are external to us, we don't produce a whole lot in the grand scheme. It means that if there are problems elsewhere, then they are automatically going to trickle to us as well. And so that is part of the problem that we've had in relation to the construction sector and in other sectors, not just that. And those issues will continue as long as there are pandemic or other related problems that create some of these supply chain and related issues.
Continue with the supply chain and with the pandemic. How has it in the construction sector, of course, has impacted the dispute management?
If I am a developer and I have entered into an arrangement with my bank that I will complete my project and repay them by August 25, whatever year that may be, right? And there is a delay in delivery by the contractor, that means I will not be able to pay. And the bank may then be forced into a position where they then have to sue me or take some other action under the terms of their contract to try to recover from me, which could also mean them getting, for example, a judgment or an award based on which they may be able to take steps to sell my assets, right? And then that happens. So the bank comes after me as a developer. What do I then do? I go after the contractor. And the contractor goes after the subcontractor. And it goes on and on. So a problem starting at what end? Because of the interconnected nature of multiple arrangements means that very often when a problem arises in the construction sector, it will not only impact two persons or two parties. It very often has a ripple effect in relation to other parties, because one break in the chain is going to affect every other aspect of it.
Okay, so in summary, how would you describe the relationship between economies and economics in construction?
Well, the construction sector is one of the most significant economic drivers in every society. And interestingly enough, it is also one of the sectors, it is the sector, frankly, which has the greatest amount of dispute resolution activity, certainly in the area of arbitration and so on, right? In any society. So what we have here is a sector which is a significant contributor to GDP. So that is sector, GDP, economics, which, and if we're talking about economic development, of course we recall that economic development is about wealth creation, which then can be leveraged in support of social and other benefits, right?
Right.
So if we then take it to that level where we are understanding and moving, where the sector is now creating those ripple effects, we understand that the sector and the chain it creates and the economics in that also then have ripple and significant impact for economic development. And the dispute-related element, of course, in it is that the moment you're having issues in the sector, those issues ultimately will result in conflicts which are in need of dispute resolution. So that, in a short, is the connection that has to be made.
Okay. So, Doc, finally, how would you then summarize the connection between financing development in emerging economies and dispute management?
Well, the financing, as we said, once you're talking about development in emerging economies or developing wherever the economies are, a significant, if not the most significant element of that is financing. In fact, G.B. Gladstone, Premier of what was then England back in in his articles of finance in the 1890s, I think it was, made the point that finance, so to speak, is the heart of the economy from which all other organs take their tone. And it is. The fact is, everything centers around money in the economies that we have. So if you're talking about finance, dispute resolution, and everything else, it all comes back to money in a way, because everything centers around, as I had said earlier, a contract. Mm-hmm. And at the heart of a contract is that a contract is there as a commercial tool. It regulates commercial transactions. So once you have that regulatory tool and there are breaks in it and money is involved, in fact, to prove the existence of a contract as distinct from a social or domestic arrangement, the critical test really is whether or not it has a commercial value. If it has a commercial value, typically you're thinking of a contract. If it does not, typically you're thinking of something which is in the nature of a social or domestic. And those are presumptions. And I'm being rough and ready in terms of what I've just said. But the fact is that contract is there with commerce in mind, with economics in mind. And once you get to that level, everything, including the disputes around it, tend to be money driven. And that once it happens, the dispute resolution now, of course, comes in because you want to ensure that there's effective regulation. And when people lose because money is involved, what have they lost? They've lost money. Mm-hmm. So they want to recover their money. So what will they do? They'll take court or other action with a view to recovering their monies. And that's dispute resolution right there for you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Malcolm. So before we go, here are today's Did You Know facts. Did you know that adjudication is a special mechanism that is used for the resolution of construction sector disputes relating to interim payments, delay and disruption of the works, extensions of time for completion of the works, defects in the works, the final account? Did you know as well that adjudication is also used for non-construction disputes, including with breach of contract and professional negligence? Well, there you go. Please remember to check out all of our podcast series, Season 2 episodes, now available on Buzzsprout, Podbean, Spreaker, and the JAIAC YouTube channel, and wherever else you get your favorite podcast. Until then, I'm Roxene Nickle, and on behalf of Dr. Christopher Malcolm, Secretary General of the JAIAC, thank you for joining us. Special thanks to our sponsors, JDIC, protecting deposits for you and me, CIADR, Regis, work your way, iNeutral, dispute resolution made easy, CP Malcolm, dispute management practitioner, ADEB Consultants, consulting engineers for almost 60 years, Impact Justice, improved access to justice in the Caribbean, and Wassel & Wassel Arbitrators Services Incorporated.
I save because one day my little business is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, and I make sure to put away a little something for him.
And thanks to JDIC, deposit insurance protection on my savings gone up.
You've been upgraded. Deposits held in commercial banks, building societies, and merchant banks are covered under the JDIC deposit insurance scheme up to $1.2 million per depositor per institution. JDIC.
Protecting deposits for you and me.
The way we do business has changed. Don't be left behind. Choose a hybrid solution for your workforce. Regis offers furnished, equipped, ready-to-use office space available for days, months, or years. Our fully serviced private office spaces give teams of all sizes an inspiring environment to focus, collaborate, and do their best work. The world is switching to hassle-free hybrid working. Join the revolution. Switch to Regis. Call 876-618-8800 or visit regis.com.jm. That's regus.com.jm.
All our episodes are also distributed on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Deezer, Stitcher, Podcast Index, Pandora, TuneIn Plus Alexa, Podchaser, Podcast Addict, and wherever else you get your favorite podcasts.